Harlem in the 1970s, an urban war zone with heroin pushers and junkies on nearly every corner. A world where street gangs control the distribution of drugs and kill in the name of commerce. Ruling these streets were two gangsters who rose from poverty and made a fortune by feeding Harlem's drug habit. One found his way to the big city from a dirt farm in North Carolina.
It's okay for people to respect you, but when they fear you, now you got the power.
The other, a native New Yorker, emerged from the ghetto.
We ruled out with our this. No questions asked.
Like their counterparts in the Italian mafia, both men tried to keep their distance from the many violent crimes committed in their names.
They sawed off his head and hands and threw the torso in the Passaic River.
They shot him at such close range that his shirt caught on fire.
For years, the authorities were powerless to stop them.
We would try to bring charges, and mysteriously the witnesses would disappear or get murdered themselves.
Their undoing would come from within. But not until they had blazed a trail of destruction straight through the heart of Harlem.
Gangland.
For a generation of kids growing up amid violence and heroin addiction, Harlem gangsters Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes were their superstars.
I didn't see anyone that made the American dream happen for them and their family through school. You know, just doing it the right way. I didn't see it. You know, when a reporter asks a 9-year-old kid, you know, who's your hero? And is Reggie Jackson your hero? He said, no, Nicky Barnes is my hero.
The kids may have glamorized the gangsters, but there was nothing glamorous about the way these two men enforced their rule on the streets of Harlem and kept their dope pushers in line.
They would take people to the base of the George Washington Bridge, and they would tell them they're going to hang them over. Very often, these people would defecate in their pants. They would bring them back up, and they would make them eat their own defecation. Teach them a lesson not to short them on the packages.
Such methods of persuasion came naturally to Frank Lucas, a native of rural North Carolina who learned early on that terror was a surefire way to exert control.
The Ku Klux Klan that came to our house and called my cousin out. And they took and tied a rope on both his arms, on each one of his arms, and spread them out. The other guy with the free hand, he took a double-barrel shotgun and jammed it in his mouth. Knocked teeth, everything out of his mouth, and pulled the trigger simultaneously.
The brutality affected Lucas profoundly.
From that day on, I've been kind of like, hey, you know what? Anybody can die for no reason. So that's where I started.
As a teenager in the late 1940s, Frank left home and headed up north to New York City. By his own account, Lucas met the infamous gangster Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in a pool hall. Bumpy was the Italian mob's man in Harlem, selling drugs and running a numbers racket.
Bumpy Johnson operated in Harlem, and he actually worked with La Cosa Nostra and as sort of their ambassador to Harlem. La Cosa Nostra, they were all white, and it wasn't a very good idea to be on the streets of Harlem.
To Lucas, Bumpy became a mentor.
Bumpy Johnson, he was like my godfather. My godfather was a cold-blooded gangster. The best they ever been, the best there is.
Bumpy gave Frank access to his rackets, grooming him as his successor. Frank not only learned how Bumpy did business in Harlem, but how the Italians ran the mob all over town. The big moment came for Frank in July of 1968 when Bumpy died of a heart attack.
What he told me was when Bumpy was dying, he was given the choice of taking over the numbers or the heroin. And he said he thought about it and thought that heroin was the up-and-coming thing, and he decided to go with the heroin.
By the late 1960s, heroin addiction was skyrocketing in New York, and Harlem was suffering the brunt of it. For the underworld, that meant a bull market for the heroin biz, and Frank was in. Lucas formed a gang named the Country Boys. Like other black street gangs, they worked with the Italian mob to get their heroin from overseas. Lucas told some of his family to come up to Harlem from North Carolina and join in the action.
My brothers is like this. If I'd have been a cop, they'd have been a cop. Whatever else I'd have been, they'd have been. I was somewhat of a crook, so they want to be a crook.
Lucas and the Country Boys were an uncompromising group of criminals who tolerated zero disloyalty to their cause, making money by selling heroin.
Somebody stole the money, somebody stole the drugs, somebody is considered weak, they're executed. You know, somebody will knock on the door, set them up, and just kill them.
As a drug kingpin, Lucas had a fierce survival instinct and was known for his quick temper.
Frank would do things on the spur of the moment, and he was the one with the temper. You did him wrong, he'd squash you like a cockroach.
According to Strikeforce Detective Richie Roberts, the Country Boys carried out shocking acts of retribution on behalf of their boss, Frank Lucas.
On one occasion, someone was murdered in the basement of one of the projects. They sawed off his head and hands and threw the torso in the Passaic River.
I ran Harlem with iron fist. I told them what to do, where to go, who to talk to, and how to do it.
One of Frank's associates was this man, Leslie Ike Atkinson. In the late 1960s, Ike was in the U.S. Army stationed in Thailand as part of the American war effort in Vietnam. Atkinson earned the nickname Sergeant Smack when he began smuggling heroin from the vast poppy fields of Thailand back to Frank and the Country Boys. The method was innovative, to say the least. Using connections on Army bases in Vietnam, Atkinson arranged to have the heroin placed secretly in the coffins of dead American GIs.
A lot of the bodies came back to North Carolina. Camp Lejeune, the Marine Corps base, was there, Fort Bragg for the airborne, and some of the information I got that there were people there, soldiers, who knew which body bags or which coffins had the dope in it. And they were also on the take, and they separated that and took it out.
Ike was not alone in the coffin scam. This former soldier went to jail for doing the same thing.
Did you put drugs in the coffins?
Of course, you put it in the coffins. Why? I mean, you're not harming anyone, are you?
Now that Frank Lucas had found his own heroin connection, he didn't need the Italian mob as much. The money really started rolling in.
At the height of its activity, he was supposed to have been transporting 1,000 kilos a year to the United States. He probably exported more than $400 million worth of drugs.
The Country Boys were taking over all the top spots in the city from old-time drug dealers. They were throwing them out, they were beating them out, they were killing them out.
Frank's counterpart on the streets of Harlem was a native New Yorker named Nicky Barnes. Nicky was born in 1933 and raised amongst these bleak tenements. By the age of 14, he was a runaway and a junkie. Today, Barnes is in the Federal Witness Protection Program and has to hide his face and disguise his voice.
I wasn't what we would call a stomp-down dope fiend, you know, a guy who was just doped up all the time. You know, I would get high and it would last me, and I had to have some to get me through each day.
Nicky quickly realized he also had a knack for selling the stuff.
I knew that I was going to make a ton of money in powder.
But first, he had to hone his skills. Nicky spent much of his early 20s in New York's Greenhaven prison for drug offenses. He made good use of the time.
Nicky was a sophisticated individual who learned management skills and organizational skills in prison.
When Barnes returned to the streets in 1969, he was clean, but he had come up with a plan to exploit the drug addiction festering in Harlem. He created a gang that would come to be known as the Council. It was made up of small groups of heroin dealers who Barnes had come to trust. The Council's power grew rapidly. And by the early 1970s, a government report called it the largest, most profitable, and most venal drug ring in New York City.
Nicky Barnes. He was the biggest heroin dealer on the East Coast. A major figure, didn't touch the dope himself, but was really responsible for its movement and distribution to the streets.
With enough business to go around, Barnes and Lucas respected each other's corners. Much like Lucas and his country boys, Nicky Barnes and the council had little tolerance for anything that got in the way of their profits.
Insofar as the security of my area is concerned, if there was any kind of what we considered usurpation of what was commonly known as ours, that would be met with sufficient overwhelming force.
Harlem, 1974. Council members go to the apartment of a junkie and small-time drug dealer. The man's sister had committed a cardinal sin. She stole $30,000 from the council's coffers.
She took the money and she run off, $30,000, man. And so it got out of hand.
The council decided that if they couldn't find the sister or the money, the brother had to pay.
He had a plastic bag on his head. Just trying to put pressure up on him to make him tell where the money is.
When persuasion didn't work, the gang gutted him like a fish on the tenement floor. All because of his association with the violent underworld of drugs.
Violence is the glue that keeps the organization going. And if you have an organization and you are not ready to employ violence, extreme violence, it means killing people, you might as well get out of town.
As the body count grew, the gangs kept getting away with murder, while Barnes and Lucas raked in millions. All the while, out on the streets, the heroin was destroying Harlem. Nicky could see it as well as anyone.
Harlem was something like war-torn Europe after the Second World War. There were so many vacant buildings, empty, vacant eyes, windows poked out like ghosts just looking out on a wasteland.
Yet somehow, in the biggest city in the richest country on the planet, the authorities seem to have surrendered Harlem to the enemy. In the early 1970s, two violent gangs rose to the top of the heroin racket in New York's Harlem neighborhood. Nicky Barnes and his council, and Frank Lucas and his country boys. They were contemporaries and rivals, but stayed out of one another's way, each content with his share of a very profitable market. The cops, meantime, were overwhelmed. New York's murder rate was soaring, just as a financial crisis was forcing the city to lay off police officers.
The streets were desolate. The people's hearts were desolate. There was nothing to do. Became easy to sell drugs.
There were a lot of addicts in Harlem. Just blatantly, you would drive in the neighborhood and people would be nodding out from shooting up the heroin.
This growing hunger for drugs was making a small group of gangsters rich beyond their wildest dreams. And the more money they made, the more they wanted. Even as Barnes and Lucas were ravaging Harlem, they became heroes on the neighborhood's sordid streets. Both from poor backgrounds, they were black men that had gone on to achieve the American dream of fabulous wealth. Residents like Anthony Gonzalez identified with their rise to power.
I was about 11, 12 years old, and what I admired was, the flashy clothes, the cars, the women, just the swagger, that came with being the hustler of the neighborhood.
The admiration felt for these drug lords was not extended to the local police. Nicky Barnes remembers the conflict residents of Harlem felt.
The relationship between the NYPD and local community was strained because people had seen too much brutality committed by policemen over the years.
This distrust of authority and the belief in the self-made lords of Harlem gave the council and the country boys free rein to do business on the streets. Open-air heroin markets flourished, bringing Barnes and Lucas hundreds of thousands of dollars a day.
When you think about that lifestyle with open-air markets with hundreds and hundreds of men in communities walking around aimlessly buying drugs, and then the leaders of the organization with the flashy clothes, the flashy jewelry, the women, the cars.
Anyone who got in the way of these spoils, especially informants, could expect a fierce reprisal.
One of them was a guy named George Ford that was allegedly peddling $12,000 worth of heroin a day in Harlem.
Ford, who dealt drugs from the counter of his candy store for Lucas, was caught in a drug sting. In exchange for a lesser sentence, he agreed to give evidence against Lucas. A few weeks later, Ford was killed with a bullet to the head. Frank Lucas went on trial for the murder. Over the years, Lucas would be charged with multiple counts of murder. But lack of evidence or eyewitness testimony ensured he was never convicted. This time was no different, and the murder served as an example to anyone who might think of crossing Lucas. It was much the same for Nicky Barnes, even though he was arrested for bribery, drug dealing, possession of dangerous weapons, and homicide. None of the charges ever stuck. Both men earned nicknames in the underworld. Frank's was Superfly, stylish and daring as he sat on the streets of Harlem watching his product sell like hotcakes.
They used to be selling my stuff downtown. I put on a hat, a wig, and some glasses, and a fake mustache, and stand right beside them. They didn't know who I was. Had a piece of car, $300 Chevrolet. They didn't know who the hell I was.
Nicky, meantime, became known as Mr. Untouchable.
Being accustomed to state surveillance, they're not going to find any drugs on me. They're not going to find me near any drugs. So what the if they want to follow me, let them do it.
Like old-time mafia dons, Lucas and Barnes insulated themselves from gang activity by using lieutenants to distribute drugs and dole out street justice. Anyone within their ranks suspected of being a rat would face execution. Lawrence Billings was a low-level associate of the council. His racket wasn't selling heroin, but the quinine used to cut it. Technically a legal drug, but because it was used by heroin dealers, buying and selling it in quantity was illegal. In the winter of 1974, the feds arrested Billings, and the gang decided he knew too much about their activities. They had a vote on whether to dispense with Billings. His fate was sealed. They decided that a council member named Wally Rice would carry out the hit.
And Wally shot him, but he didn't kill him.
The gunshot tore Billings' face off, but he lived. Authorities took him into protective custody, hoping to keep him alive to testify against the council. But while he was holed up in the Prince George Hotel with police protection, Billings stole away in the middle of the night.
And he was with sick, and Wally got to him and gave him some money.
Billings was never seen again. In the early 1970s, just as the council and the country boys were making their mark on the streets of Harlem, the civil rights movement was taking a militant turn. Groups like the Black Panthers were at the heart of the new Black Power movement. Nicky Barnes and his council took their cues from these groups as they took over the distribution of heroin from old-time white gangsters in the Italian mob who had historically dealt heroin in Harlem.
Black gangsters in Harlem were starting to demand more and more of the pie. So we're starting to see the emergence of the big bad gangsters.
When these men spoke about them taking the streets back and dealing it to their own people, depends what aspect I look at it from. If I look at it from society, it's terrible. It's disgusting, you know. But when I look at it from their point of view, I can understand.
The council was comprised of 7 members. All were black Muslims and believers in the Black Power movement. Nicky Barnes decided that controlling the distribution and sale of drugs in Harlem was their right.
Nicky's organization would not have whites coming into Harlem to run his business. You supply me with the drugs, I pay you for it, and that's it.
That's the kind of deal Nicky made with the Genovese Mafia family. And the mob was happy to avoid a bloody turf war with the black gangs. Both sides understood that heroin was strictly business. Barnes believed in operating his gang using a corporate philosophy, with himself as the CEO. He and his council lived by a 7-word mantra.
Treat my brother as I treat myself. A very strong mantra that would always maintain equilibrium among the council members and reduce conflict.
As the profits from their connections mounted, both Lucas and Barnes made a perverse attempt at public relations. They shared their wealth with the very communities they were preying on.
I was Robin Hood, for real. I was the real Robin Hood down there. I did nice things for people, I really did. Clothes and stuff, I bought them, so that's why I was such a fixture in Harlem.
Turkeys for Thanksgiving Day, or this so-and-so, come over and get these, and give it to your mama for Mother's Day, stuff like that.
Mickey Barnes and Frank Lucas had finally achieved the status and money they had sought for so long. They became examples to some segments of the community of success.
They didn't bow and scrape, didn't have to. They were heroes in their community. And we didn't have heroes in our communities. Most of our heroes were athletes or musicians. Now you have somebody who's there each and every day and driving the big cars and giving out turkeys and Thanksgiving, and someone falls upon hard times and can't pay the rent, they'll pay the rent for them. They did things, and they were very visible, that the white man did not do.
Nicky Barnes would come by. These guys would come to the basketball tournaments. They would, give ice cream to the kids in the neighborhood, and this is what I admired. This is what I wanted to be when I grew up.
As Harlem watched its Black Angels climb, there seemed to be no stopping their success. But for Barnes and Lucas, there was a risk to achieving such a high profile in the underworld. Blinded by their wealth and power, they never saw it coming. While Watergate was bringing down the Nixon presidency, and America was losing a war in Vietnam, Harlem was crumbling under the weight of gangs who were making millions selling drugs in the community. Frank Lucas remembers what life was like at the top.
I was a swinger, had everything to go with it, from the jewelry to the clothes to the shoes to the whatever. I had it all. From the Rolls Royces to the Mercedes to the Cadillacs to whatever. I had it all. I lived in the Essex House on 59th Street in Central Park South.
Lucas and Nicky Barnes, leaders of two of the most violent gangs to roam the streets of New York, lived in a way most Harlem residents could only imagine.
I really liked the Maserati because of the speed. I always had a Benz. I liked the Corniche. But the only thing about the Corniche is just that it rode too much like a Cadillac, and I didn't like Cadillacs.
I had every girl from Hollywood to 8th Avenue, National or whatever, one time or another, she was my girl. The most beautiful creature you ever seen in the world. That was my woman.
Even if you didn't see Frank, there was an electricity in the air. People were alive and vibrant, but you knew that he was in town, he was around. He had his Superfly clothes on. He always had a bunch of good-looking women around, and he'd be in the bars and he'd spend money, and he was very loud.
Outside the limelight, both the council and the country boys saw themselves as serious businessmen.
I just do what I gotta do to make some money. And that's what I've been doing all my life. I'm a hell of a businessman.
Frank Lucas, the businessman, was, how can I put this? He was a ruthless capitalist. Whoever stood in his way, he knocked out of his way. He just wanted to make as much money as he could.
Lucas was presiding over a sophisticated drug handling operation. As kilo after kilo of heroin made its way through New York's ports, the purity of the product was cut from 90% down to around 3%.
Heroin doesn't go out in the street in a pure form. You cut it with either mannite or quinine, increase the amount of powder in the street, and thereby increasing your profits.
Quinine, a legal drug, would give a powerful burning sensation when injected with heroin. Mannite, a laxative powder, was cheap and easy to obtain.
So instead of having 1 kilo at 90%, you'd have 30 kilos at 3%. And if you're making an average of $300,000 per key, times 30. And when you brought in a kilo of heroin, you don't bring just 1 kilo in, maybe you bring 10, 20, 50 kilos. And the process would just continue.
Heroin mills, where the powder was cut and put in small plastic bags, looked like white powder production lines.
It's a place where the narcotics was packaged. And when I say packaged, it was packaged for street level. And the street level package was that large spoon on the metal ring that we measure for baby food.
Gangs employed women to work long shifts at night in the mills. The women were often forced to work in the nude, initially to prevent theft, but later to ensure they worked quickly.
It evolved because we realized that a woman sitting up there naked, they're going to get that stuff packaged, get their clothes on, and boogie.
Once the heroin had been measured into the bags, they'd be marked with the dealer stamp, like Frank Lucas's Blue Magic.
Blue Magic was a much higher quality. The quality was like 1 to 3% dope before Frank. When the Country Boys came in, it could be up to 10%.
Lucas's new high-quality heroin was meant to blow his business competitor Nicky Barnes out of the market, where addicts were desperate to buy the most potent heroin. Instead, Blue Magic brought a deadly backlash. Addicts found themselves overdosing on Frank's product.
The problem with the higher quality was that some people OD'd. A lot of people OD'd.
Heroin was killing people. Thousands and thousands and thousands of teenagers were killed.
Lucas's product might have been good, but there was still plenty of business to go around. As Nicky Barnes saw his empire expand, he had visions of starting legitimate businesses like nightclubs and real estate investments with the money he had earned selling drugs.
We're talking, trying to do things and, you know, to have an initial public offering and go on the stock market and what were the requirements and how much money we need to have and, you know, could we do all of these things?
Barnes had raised himself up to a level he couldn't see himself falling from.
Nicky is the king of strut. I mean, he is the king of the street. He is the, if you will, the black godfather of Harlem.
In the mid-'70s, Louis Diaz went to work for the council, buying small amounts of heroin and laundering money. Even though he was white, he seemed to have promise as a potential gangster.
Louis Diaz was a sharp guy.
But Diaz wasn't what he seemed to be.
Louis Diaz is the one who ultimately set up how the operation was going to go that would enable them to snare me and pull down the council.
Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas had ruled Harlem like kings. But hidden forces were preparing to overthrow them. During the early 1970s, the heroin gangs of Harlem not only controlled the drug trade, they also had connections in the NYPD. The most notorious was a cop named Elmer Morris. His brother-in-law was a top lieutenant in Nicky Barnes's council. He got the council firearms and martial arts training, and when anyone informed on the gang, Morris passed his name along. Joseph Beecham was one of Morris's unfortunate victims. After Morris confirmed Beecham was an informant, a council member lured Beecham to a meeting in an awaiting car. Once Beecham was inside, he was shot in the face and killed. Though few were as deadly as Morris, many New York police officers were on the take. Underpaid cops found themselves being offered bribes that were more than they earned in months.
Policemen weren't paid a lot of money. And if you're making $20,000 a year, $25,000 a year, and someone comes along, $5,000. I know you patrol this block. Don't come by. Patrol the next block. Or check this license plate out. Is this guy an informant? Or who is this guy? $10,000. And, you know, you do it once and now they've got you.
With heroin gangs seemingly running the streets, the DEA intervened. But pinning a case on an operator like Frank Lucas would be difficult, as Agent Jack Toll quickly learned.
He ran it as a tight ship. He oversaw what was going on. He wanted to know at each level what was going on, and he carved out territory, which he kept because of a good source of supply and intimidation.
Intimidation seemed to be one of Lucas's self-admitted specialties.
It's okay for people to respect you. They're real good when they respect you. But when they fear you, now you got the power.
Starting in the summer of 1974, a DEA team put Frank Lucas under constant surveillance. Their goal was to piece together enough witness testimony to prove that Lucas had been involved in a continuing criminal enterprise. Just over the border in Newark, New Jersey, where Frank Lucas was living at the time, Richie Roberts headed a strike force that was also watching Lucas. He was shocked by the gang's brutality.
One of the MOs of the country boys in Newark was to take somebody up on the project roofs, usually their own people, who would short them on a package or steal some money, and throw them off the roof.
After months of investigations, the DEA's case against Lucas stalled. Then, in autumn of 1974, a surprise witness came forward. It was none other than Lucas's accountant.
This fellow was on parole and a former convict. They locked him up. He's facing a lot of time. I remember asking him to cooperate. And he thought about it. Didn't give me an answer right away. I eventually got a call, and he started telling us about what Frank was doing.
As a result, Lucas was arrested for conspiracy to obtain and distribute large amounts of heroin. But by Christmas 1974, he was once again acquitted for lack of evidence.
I have always said that if a guy is a bad guy and he beats you, he'll be back in the system. Frank was back in the system.
In January of 1975, a strike force of DEA agents and New York police officers, acting on an informant's tip, surrounded Frank Lucas at his house in Teaneck, New Jersey.
From what the agents have told me that were there, they surrounded the house, and once they went to the door, Frank's wife started throwing out bags of money. Which time they grabbed all the bags and brought them in and arrested Frank.
All told, there was over $500,000 in small bills at the Lucas residence that evening. Lucas was arrested and put on trial for a series of new federal charges. One of a continuing criminal enterprise, of breaking the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, and several other felonies that were now corroborated by eyewitness testimony. Once Lucas had been dispensed with, the DEA turned to the council and its leader, Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable.
Nicky was a guy who would never talk on the phone. He would never handle a package. He would be nowhere around it. So if you made a case on Nicky, it had to be circumstantial evidence.
A young agent from Brooklyn named Louis Diaz was hoping to change all that. In the summer of 1976, America was celebrating its bicentennial, just as Diaz was taking on the riskiest assignment of his career. He was going undercover inside Barnes's operation.
I came up with this scenario that I was a renegade mob guy. I went to California to chill out for about a year or so, you know? And I got a little tired of Surf City. And I thought it was time to come back. So when I came back to New York, I wanted to get back into the heroin trade, but I wasn't going to depend on the Italians.
Diaz made friends with junior members of the council and started living in their world. He was amazed at the power they had.
We were so respected. We would walk into a club, whether it was the Hubba Hubba, the Con Club, or Jagazzi's, and most guys, you know, like you check in your coat and they give you a ticket. Well, you would check in your gun and they give you a ticket.
Over the course of several months, Diaz put his life in grave danger.
Agents have died. Believe me, many have been killed working undercover. It was a risky business to pretend to be a dope buyer and dealer with people who have no concern for the loss of life.
My father told me many things. And one of the things that he told me as a kid was that never go into a fight thinking what the other guy is going to do to you. Never. Only what you're going to do to him. I never feared for my life. I never thought about it.
Two of Diaz's contacts in the council were Guy Fisher and Joseph Hayden, a.k.a. Jazz. Both were vicious, and especially so when it came to killing a member of the mob who had gotten in their way.
Guy Fisher and Joseph Hayden whacked a guy by the name of Carmen Puglisi. They shot him at such close range that his shirt caught on fire.
Working carefully within the organization, Diaz formed a relationship with Jazz Hayden, who had no idea Diaz was a federal agent.
Jazz is talking to me, telling me about him, praising him, and telling me how high up he is in organized crime.
And as Jazz talked, Louis Diaz was wearing a wire. For 8 months, Diaz came to understand how the council functioned.
In order to conduct that type of organization, you don't do it as an altar boy. There was a lot of murders and killings involved. And Nicky, to some degree, was part and parcel of those murders. And they were committed as a matter of doing business.
In March of 1977, Nicky Barnes was driving through Harlem on what seemed to be an average day.
I kept hearing these rotors going, and I looked up and there was a helicopter up there. The chopper dropped down a little bit lower. With the bull on top of the car, and everybody turned their sirens on. There was a car in the block, and there was a whole lot of drama. And it was all over.
Barnes was arrested, but instead of the New York Police Department, this time it was the feds. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes had lived the high life at a terrible cost to the people of Harlem. Now the full force of the federal government, right up to the White House, was coming down on them. But no one was sure who would win. In January 1975, Frank Lucas, one of the most powerful drug lords in New York City, went on trial. Lucas was tried by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan and convicted of conspiracy to distribute narcotics. His sentence, 40 years in prison. Almost immediately, Lucas was then indicted by the state of New Jersey, where he lived. Former detective Richie Roberts was there for the trial.
I had observed him before, but the first time I met him was at the trial. I was sitting at the table, and the courtroom was full of celebrities. And Frank came in with his lawyers and their paralegals and their secretaries like a rock star.
In New Jersey, Lucas was convicted of conspiracy and given a 30-year sentence for a total of 70 years behind bars. Lucas was 44 at the time.
When we arrest somebody, and if they were in their early 20s or early 30s, you know, they had that cockiness and swagger, I'll do my jail time. But then when you arrest them and they're in their 40s and early 50s, nobody wants to go to jail.
The gangster who had once prided himself on killing anyone who turned against him now decided to flip. Lucas cut a deal with the U.S. Attorney to have his sentence reduced, providing information that would assist in the arrest of almost 100 gangsters. In an unrelated case, Lucas's rival Nicky Barnes was about to go down too. In March of 1977, after an 8-month investigation, DEA agent Louis Diaz had gathered the evidence needed to indict Barnes for running a continuing criminal enterprise. The charge carried a life sentence. As Barnes' lawyers prepared his case to go to trial, he was approached by the New York Times Magazine for a story, complete with a front cover photo.
That's the New York Times doing the photos for the New York Times. So what they did was they went back and they got a bunch of mugshots. The New York Times did this. And they put 4 of them together and they said, here's the deal. Either you give us a reasonably pleasant picture to go on the cover, or we're gonna put these 4 mugshots on there. That's how it happened. So I said, okay.
Nicky picked a red, white, and blue tie to show himself as an all-American businessman.
That New York Times Sunday article appeared in July, and I still remember the headline on the caption, Nicky Barnes. The police say he's Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it?
The photo made the new president, Jimmy Carter, livid.
President Carter called the Attorney General, who was at that time Griffin Bell, who then contacted the head of DEA and the U.S. Attorney and then basically said, I hope we have a good, strong case against these guys because this is the most important case in the United States of America.
But even Louis Diaz wondered if Mr. Untouchable would go down. He'd already been tried and acquitted on various charges, including murder, a total of 13 times.
You just hope that you got the right fruit in that basket, and the jury are going to eat from it, and they're going to return that verdict.
To prevent the jurors from being intimidated by pressure from the gang, the judge ensured the trial would include the first ever anonymous jury.
The judge mandated that no one was to know the addresses or the names of these people on the jury because Nicky was good at getting to the people.
On January 19th, 1978, the jury reached its verdict. When it was read guilty, there was a gasp in the courtroom.
That was a shock to many of the people in Harlem because they didn't think this person was touchable. But he did get touched, and he did get put down.
It turns out what we brought to the table was enough to convict Nicky on most of the counts that were brought against him. He was convicted of a continuing criminal enterprise, which carries a life sentence.
Nicky Barnes was sent to the highest security prison in the U.S. in Marion, Illinois. Even though he was in prison, Barnes was relying on the mantra of the council, treat my brother as I treat myself.
I just had assumed that my crew, they were going to take care of business the same way without me as they did with me. But I was just mistaken.
Rumors began to filter back to Barnes that his second-in-command, Guy Fisher, was having an affair with Barnes' wife. For Barnes, this was an unforgivable violation of his code of honor. It was enough to make him turn on his fellow gangsters. It would be his last act of revenge against those who betrayed him.
His wife was going with someone, disrespecting him, and he just got fed up and pissed off, and he called up and he started cooperating.
One by one, aided by Barnes' testimony, each member of the council was convicted of drug trafficking and given a lengthy prison sentence. By 1984, a majority of the council and the country boys were either on trial, in jail, or dead. The days of these heroin kingpins were finished. Cocaine had taken over as the drug of choice in New York, and crack quickly surpassed it as the most lucrative street drug. Today, Nicky Barnes is out of jail after serving more than 20 years of a life sentence. He's in the Witness Protection Program after giving federal evidence against dozens of his previous associates. He has a new name and a new identity, and he hasn't been back to Harlem since the day he was arrested.
I did what I had to do in order to survive. And now to be sanctimonious about it and say, I just moved on from that part of my life. I'm not dealing with that anymore.
Now, Barnes works a 9-to-5 job in a quiet suburb somewhere in America.
I get in my car at the same time every day, and I come back home the same time and every day, just like everybody else in the neighborhood. So I'm a working guy, and it's okay.
But some aren't so quick to forget the former life of Nicky Barnes.
I think my feeling still is that he should be in prison, despite his change of living habits. The fact that he's a grandfather. There are a lot of grandfathers that have lost grandchildren because of what he did.
Frank Lucas is also a grandfather in his late 70s. He's wheelchair-bound after a car accident broke his legs and diabetes crippled his hands. After more than 30 years since his conviction, Lucas says he has no regrets about his years as a drug kingpin, and that given the chance, he'd do it again.
If I went to school, Donald Trump wouldn't have a change in Wall Street. Well, I didn't have nothing. I didn't have nothing. You gotta remember, I didn't have no food sometimes. I come from dirt and made myself a multi-millionaire. So what else do you want out of life?
To stop them.
We would try to bring charges, and mysteriously witnesses would disappear or get murdered themselves.
Their undoing would come from within. But not until they had blazed a trail of destruction straight through the heart of Harlem.
Gangland.
For a generation of kids growing up amid violence and heroin addiction, Harlem gangsters Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes were their superstars.
I didn't see anyone that made the American dream happen for them and their family through school. You know, just doing it the right way. I didn't see it. You know, when a reporter asks a 9-year-old kid, you know, who's your hero? And is Reggie Jackson your hero? He said no.
Harlem in the 1970s, an urban war zone with heroin pushers and junkies on nearly every corner. A world where street gangs control the distribution of drugs and kill in the name of commerce. Ruling these streets were two gangsters who rose from poverty and made a fortune by feeding Harlem's drug habit. One found his way to the big city from a dirt farm in North Carolina.
It's okay for people to respect you, but when they fear you, now you got the power.
The other, a native New Yorker, emerged from the ghetto.
We ruled out with our like this. No questions asked.
Like their counterparts in the Italian mafia, both men tried to keep their distance from the many violent crimes committed in their names.
They sawed off his head and hands and threw the torso in the Passaic River.
They shot him at such close range that his shirt caught on fire.
For years, the authorities were
Nicky Barnes is my hero.
The kids may have glamorized the gangsters, but there was nothing glamorous about the way these two men enforced their rule on the streets of Harlem and kept their dope pushers in line.
They would take people to the base of the George Washington Bridge, and they would tell them they're going to hang them over. Very often, these people would defecate in their pants. They would bring them back up, and they would make them eat their own defecation. Teach them a lesson not to short them on the packages.
Such methods of persuasion came naturally to Frank Lucas, a native of rural North Carolina who learned early on that terror was a surefire way to exert control.
The Ku Klux Klan came out of a house and called my cousin out. And they took and tied a rope on both his arms, on each one of his arms, and spread them out. The other guy with the free hand, he took a double-barrel shotgun and jammed it in his mouth. Knocked teeth, everything out of his mouth, and pulled the trigger simultaneously.
The brutality affected Lucas profoundly.
From that day on, I've been kind of like, hey, you know what? Anybody can die for no reason. So that's where I started.
As a teenager in the late 1940s, Frank left home and headed up north to New York City. By his own account, Lucas met the infamous gangster Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in a pool hall. Bumpy was the Italian mob's man in Harlem, selling drugs and running a numbers racket.
Bumpy Johnson operated in Harlem, and he actually worked with La Cosa Nostra and as sort of their ambassador to Harlem. La Cosa Nostra, they were all white, and it wasn't a very good idea to be on the streets of Harlem.
To Lucas, Bumpy became a mentor.
Bumpy Johnson, he was like my godfather. My godfather was a cold-blooded gangster. The best they ever been, the best there is.
Bumpy gave Frank access to his rackets, grooming him as his successor. Frank not only learned how Bumpy did business in Harlem, but how the Italians ran the mob all over town. The big moment came for Frank in July of 1968 when Bumpy died of a heart attack.
What he told me was when Bumpy was dying, he was given the choice of taking over the numbers or the heroin. And he said he thought about it and thought that heroin was the up-and-coming thing, and he decided to go with the heroin.
By the late 1960s, heroin addiction was skyrocketing in New York, and Harlem was suffering the brunt of it. For the underworld, that meant a bull market for the heroin biz, and Frank was in. Lucas formed a gang named the Country Boys. Like other black street gangs, they worked with the Italian mob to get their heroin from overseas. Lucas told some of his